Hello everybody, Chocolate Guy here, and welcome back to a long-awaited countdown. Earlier on in my channel's history, I made an amount of SpongeBob videos that were some of my most successful up until that point, and are still some of my highest viewed now. After talking about Season 4 back in 2022, I intended to talk about Season 5 at some point in the near future, but the timing was just never right. But 3 years later, I'm finally back to take a look at the 5th season of SpongeBob, which I'm excited to talk about because Season 5 is probably the most interesting season yet, for a lot of different reasons. Firstly, because like Season 4, just how much of the public perception around it has changed over the years. Back when SpongeBob discourse was at its peak online, and when I grew up being engaged with the show, the season was pretty unpopular, and was considered by many to be the show's first bad season through and through. But nowadays, from the little I have seen of online SpongeBob discussion, I think people look back on this one a little more fondly at the very least, like Season 4, though nowhere near as fondly as that season. What do I think of it? It's pretty mediocre, and an overall noticeable step down from Season 4. While we definitely aren't in bad territory yet, we are steadily getting there. And while I'm not the biggest fan of Season 4 and the direction it takes the show in, I can acknowledge that it tried to be a faithful follow-up to Season 3 with some changes, and there was a fair amount of quality, and most of the season fell towards the middle, along with the worst episodes not being that bad, for the most part. Season 5's biggest changes are reeling back the more story-driven episodes, though there are still some episodes like that, and focusing a bit more on comedy, which is great on paper, but in execution, a lot of the episodes this season aren't that funny, or still don't have that many jokes, especially compared to something you would see in a pre-first movie episode. This season, in turn, also throws every random idea the show has ever had at the wall to see what will stick, which does lead to some episodes really going all out with some great ideas, but simultaneously, and more often, while the season can be ambitious in this way, it can also be super uninspired in others, as many episodes feel like someone had an idea that was clearly shitty, but nobody cared enough to say no, and they just pooped out a terrible episode not giving a damn. It makes a lot of episodes in this season feel uninspired at best and questionably terrible at worst. By the end of the season, it kind of felt like the writers were running out of ideas, and this is only Season 5 of a show that is currently in its 15th season. There's also some cool format changes this season, with the inclusion of shorts, 2 more specials, and a TV movie, but the quality on all that varies drastically as well. At its best, there are some really cool and creative episodes this season that I will talk about next time, and there are still some really funny ones as well. And the good episodes this season are at least on par with the good episodes of Season 4, maybe even better. But there are more middle-of-the-road episodes this time around, and bad episodes, and the bad episodes there are this season are a lot worse overall, and that's what I'll be talking about today. And they're worse because of the reasons I previously stated, but also because all the really bad elements of Season 4, with character flanderization and their worst attributes being played up, are so much worse in this season, making characters feel like even more of flanderized parodies of themselves. And the overall joke writing and quality of writing in general is just worse overall this season. But interestingly enough though, while the worst of Season 4 was annoying, the worst of Season 5 is more uninspired and boring for reasons that are more interesting than the actual episodes themselves. Though this doesn't apply to all the bad episodes, it's a pretty decent rule of thumb. There's a lot to talk about with this season's worst episodes, so let's get right into it. Here is my list of the top 5 worst SpongeBob Season 5 episodes. So as previously stated, this season has an amount of 4 to 7 minute shorts, and majority of them are honestly pretty good, making great use of the format to tell some stellar jokes in a shortened time period for ideas that couldn't quite fit that 11-minute mark, and therefore don't overstay their welcome. But at the same time, none of them are amazing or on my best list proper, and some of them are pretty bad, in the same way a lot of other Season 5 episodes are bad, but just shorter. And while Pat No Pay is uncreative and dull, and Waiting is a slog that feels way longer than it is, the worst of them for me is Boat Smarts. Maybe this isn't one of the worst episodes of the season because it is really short and takes less time to get through than any of the other episodes on this list or the ones that just missed out on it. Much shorter in some cases, but this episode just infuriates me enough for it to sneak on. The Krusty Krab training video is a brilliant episode and my favorite of the show because it has such a genius premise they get some of the best scenes and jokes out of. This episode rips that one off, but instead of doing that, tells one horrible joke over and over again that would already be lame and really crappy before you realize they completely botch SpongeBob's boating school experience for this joke to even make sense. SpongeBob is nervous behind the wheel. He's not just a careless menace. So the premise of the joke was just shitty to begin with. And all the scenes of him being a bad driver just amount to random people and Squidward getting hurt, which is just so fun and funny. And even beyond that, this episode really bothers me because while I know it's not supposed to be educational and is a parody of instruction videos, just having an episode about good driving techniques and then actively punishing a character who is using those techniques while the one who isn't gets off scot-free the entire time is pretty gross and stupid. Squidward actively gets punished for using his seatbelt, and there are many other times during this episode when he did nothing wrong and gets punished for SpongeBob's bad behavior, and SpongeBob does walk away perfectly fine every time. He never gets hurt, he never gets punished, he's just fine. And look, I don't think the episode takes itself seriously enough for a kid to actually take anything away from this in a super serious manner, like the message that wearing your seatbelt is bad or anything, but it is still pretty bad, especially when the episode would have been funnier if SpongeBob did get hurt for his bad driving techniques, or maybe he was more nervous like he should be, and each time gets a little further driving, but forgets some boating technique and ends up crashing. That could have been a way funnier use of this concept. Just anything would have been better than what we actually got. So yeah, while this is one of the season's shortest, I personally think it's one of the worst because of how it rips off such a great episode just to coast off of that episode's success while getting the worst, most lazy use out of that concept. Telling painfully unfunny jokes that misunderstand basic elements of the show at best, or punish someone for wearing a seatbelt at worst. Just truly awful. But because it is so short, that did end up sparing it from being any higher since the competition was really steep, and I guess I would rather sit through 4 minutes of this than 11 minutes of what's coming next. Okay, so this episode is significant to the show for one big reason. This is the first full-on gross-out episode of the show, and that element becomes more prominent going forward, though outside of some select episodes, it's not as bad as some have made it out to be. But this would still be the catalyst for more gross-out focused episodes in the show. I don't like that element of the show. The very limited amount we saw of it in the pre-first movie wasn't that strong either to really begin with, and it's worse when they amp it up around this time, not being funny at all and just kinda gross for the sake of being gross, including this episode, shocker of all shockers. With all that said though, that's honestly not why this episode made the list, over some really big stinkers. While this episode is gross and doesn't do anything funny with that element, it doesn't personally gross me out. Instead, it bores me to tears. This is one of the most boring episodes of the show up until this point, because there are barely any jokes, and the story of this fungus spreading, the episode doesn't even take remotely seriously. Like, the logic around how visible the fungus is changes at random, so most of the episode is just characters scratching themselves, or the fungus spreading, and people getting mad, usually at SpongeBob. That's it. If you don't find this episode really gross, you're gonna want to jump out a window from boredom. And while there are a few jokes, the ones there are pretty bland and predictable. The only time this episode kinda takes itself seriously as a story with a conflict, it's just to shit all over SpongeBob, which is just annoying and unpleasant. Like, SpongeBob shouldn't have gone to work and served people food with such a gross fungus on his head. He's in the wrong for that. But the amount of shit he goes through is so excessive, and once again, not fun or funny. I really just don't understand what this episode was trying to accomplish, or who it was even made for. They put a lot of emphasis on this fungus, but it's honestly not very visually interesting, or even that gross in a funny way. There's barely any jokes, and the story once again just doesn't take itself seriously at all. It doesn't make much sense, and it's not a gripping narrative by any means. And this episode doesn't have enough of a premise to begin with in any respect to be just a fun, silly romp at all. Top that all off with a dumb twist ending that's completely pointless because this episode sucks, and you have one of the season's worst. But if you thought this episode was boring, hoo boy, you ain't seen nothing yet. So this might be my most surprising take in this video. Not because I think this episode is terrible, most people do, or at least did for a while. I'm not really sure what modern day public opinion on this episode is. The reason I say this take is pretty hot, or at least I assume it would, is that I don't think most would call this a bottom 5 episode for this season. But man, it is just undeniable for me that this is the worst 22-minute special so far in the show, by a huge margin. By trying to do a similar thing as Dunces and Dragons, while simultaneously being one of the most boring episodes of the show as well. This episode has kind of a fun premise of SpongeBob characters being set in a Western setting, but they do literally nothing with this idea, and the episode moves at a snail's pace. For some reason, instead of just ripping off Dunces and Dragons directly, having SpongeBob go to this Western setting, we get this awfully long and drawn-out intro scene about SpongeBob being sad he doesn't have a famous relative, which is just so dumb. Like, who cares? Who wanted to see SpongeBob struggle with this? Is it funny? No. Is it actually interesting? Does it connect to the plot in an interesting way? Not really, because there isn't much of a story. He just struggles with this, he finds out he has a distant relative who's famous, and then at the end of the episode he's happy. That's it. Who cares? It's just to eat up time because there wasn't enough story in the main part of the episode, which is the actual Western part. If they had to do a long setup to this Western episode, I don't understand why they couldn't have chosen literally any other more interesting or funny hook. It's just such a bad way to start the episode and sets the tone for this mess perfectly. Because after SpongeBob bumming around being sad, we're introduced to the actual story of this episode involving his great whatever grandpa SpongeBob and how he saved this town from plankton. And this story fails in every conceivable way, if I didn't give that impression off already. What could have been a fun Western adventure with SpongeBob characters just becomes the most stock, dumbed down Western plot you've ever seen with no real twist to speak of, other than Plankton isn't actually a threat in any way, and there's no reason for people to consider him a threat or be afraid of him, but they are for some reason. It's not really much of a joke, they don't really play it up for humor, they take Plankton seriously as a legitimate villain until the very end for a stupid punchline. It's really strange, and it makes this episode even harder to take seriously as a narrative or to get any humor out of because it's not a joke. So on top of all of that, you can't even take SpongeBob's conflict with him seriously because he's not a serious villain. I don't know why this episode didn't make him bigger or give him goons to make him more of a threat, or once again, if they're gonna fully focus on the comedy angle, actually play up the joke of these townsfolk thinking he's actually a threat when he's not. But they didn't do any of this because it feels like nobody gave a shit about this special. That's why every story beat is so lifeless and generic, and you know exactly where every scene is gonna go and how every joke is gonna play out. That's also why there's barely any jokes to begin with, and the ones there are the laziest, least creative ones you could think of. That's why the only thing this episode really does to make it stand out is to give most of our characters fake southern accents that are annoying. This episode would be easier to sit through if the characters did just use their normal voices and they wrote an actual story for this episode that was fun and had any sort of real stakes. And that's also why this episode is slower than a fucking turtle. Every scene moves so slowly, the pacing is awful. There's no real sense of further momentum or energy in this supposedly fun Western special, which makes how little substance this episode has all the more significantly worse. There's just nothing to get out of this episode, and it has one of the weirdest and lamest endings of any SpongeBob episode, with SpongeBob figuring out that the statue with poop on it is of the said relative and washes the shit away just for the scallops to come back ready to shit on it again. If there was any episode that deserved to have a shit-filled ending, I guess it was this one. This whole thing is just so pointless, and there's just nothing in this episode I get anything out of. I truly did not remember or expect this episode to be this bad, but oh my god, it really stinks, and might be the episode I enjoy watching the least from this season. But the next two are close and might beat it in that category, and are just such a special level of terrible, much beyond this one, so let's get into that. So SpongeHenge is an episode that isn't the most boring or the one I get the least out of watching, but it is the one I understand the appeal for the absolute least. This one is impressively bad. I know I've said previously that I don't understand why an episode like Fungus Among Us was made and who it was made for, but in all seriousness, I can understand why, on paper at least, a writer would be interested in tackling certain elements and who those elements appeal to, even if in execution the episode is dreadfully bad. But for this episode, I just don't even know. I don't really even know how to talk about it because it is really bad, but in a way that kind of breaks my brain. Not to rip off Pie Guy Rules, but when watching the episode, I couldn't stop thinking about a quote from his season 5 video that this feels like a bad parody to a movie that doesn't even exist. But that's only really the tip of the iceberg of why this episode sucks. The episode tries to parody some elements from a few movies, but doesn't get that much out of any of them, so it ends up feeling like this weird mismatch of ideas, and the episode is so non-distinct, but weirdly distinct at the same time, that it feels like it's ripping off something, but actually isn't. I guess what I'm trying to get at is that this episode tries to be so many things, but fails to combine any of them into a meaningful package, so it leads to one of the most unsatisfying viewing experiences. It wants to be a serious apocalyptic story, but it still tries to treat itself like a goofy SpongeBob episode. It wants to be weird and uncanny with SpongeBob's music coming out of his holes. Oh my god, pause! But it doesn't actually do much with this besides the same joke of the jellyfish swarming him over and over again. It wants to be a semi-parody of parts of some films, but doesn't really commit to either parody. They also just don't get a lot of humor out of any of these events, of SpongeBob getting isolated and the wind destroying everything. The episode really is just season 5 at its worst. All these random ideas that honestly don't really have much of a chance for success to begin with, just being slammed together in a meaningless and pointless mess that ends up being so strange for that reason, but actually trying to sit down and watch it, once again, is a boring slog. Maybe they thought the song and the StoneHenges would be fun and appealing to kids in an interesting and kind of uncanny way that could appeal to kids for just how weird it is, but they don't do anything with it until the very end. And while it's the only part of the episode that is actually uncanny, it's just weird and unsettling for the sake of it because the rest of the episode is a mess. So it doesn't end up actually meaning anything. It's just something that happens. It's the only part of the episode that actually kind of unsettles me, but not in a cool way, but more in a why does this kid show feel like it's a bad creepypasta kind of way. And the episode's twist ending, with everyone being gone and the StoneHenges being this creepy remain of any signs of life years later, is also just so strange because once again, the episode doesn't take itself seriously enough or play this for any sort of comedic value, so it all just feels like a kid show tackling apocalyptic, depressing, weird stuff it really shouldn't. It's just so off-putting, and not in any sort of cool or fun or funny way, because the episode just has all this ending stuff linger there, while the rest of the episode is this stupid, pointless, silly romp that's just kind of weird and not funny, or particularly interesting. Just such a confusing mess, that I think, for all these reasons, is significantly worse than the last two, even if I think it shares some things in common with Fungus Among Us, and Pest of the West might be the more boring episode. I may come back to talk about this episode in the future, because it really is just so fascinating for why it's so bad, and in any other video, for any other season, this would be an easy lock for the #1 spot. But there was one episode that was much worse. Oh dear. But before we get into what I consider to be the worst episode of the season, here are 7 dishonorable mentions. Season 5 had a lot of really bad episodes, and in a better season, any one of these 7 could have made the list or even been #1, and a few of them just escaped the fate of being on the list proper. I know last season I talked about all the episodes in my honorable and dishonorable mentions, but I honestly don't really feel like doing that for this season. So I'm gonna cover 7 on each list and save any other episodes I want to talk about for individual episode reviews. Pointless. Has a bad and unfunny premise, spends the whole episode on the same joke premise, and it never gets any funnier, and then when it feels like it runs out of ideas for that, it randomly becomes the lamest Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episode. Like, what a waste. They're barely in the episode, they contribute nothing, and Barnacle Boy doesn't really even have any lines. What kept this one off the list is because the back end is slightly better than the first portion, which is better than some of the actual episodes on the list, and there are a few moments that I do find mildly entertaining, sparing it from being in the top 5. So I know some people consider this to be the worst season 5 short, and while I get why, as it is pretty terrible, I do think there are a few funny moments that save it, like the scene right when the toy breaks being pretty solid, and I even find the twist of what the toy actually is kind of funny as well. but a lot of the episode is just SpongeBob waiting around, being a jerk, and acting like an out-of-character child. It's so repetitive and so boring. It feels way longer than it actually is. This episode really drags. It's kinda painful at some points. If it was any longer in actual length, or those positives didn't exist, it would definitely be on the list proper. But as it stands, it's not an F tier episode, more of a D-. To Love a Patty is an F tier episode, through and through. I don't even care whether SpongeBob is in character or not, or it's in his nature for having feelings for a Krabby Patty. That's the least of this episode's problems, and if you get really caught up on that, I don't even know, who cares? The main problem is that all this episode is just SpongeBob talking about how much he loves this Krabby Patty, him personifying it, and then taking it on dates. It all amounts to essentially one joke of just, isn't this weird that he's in love with a Krabby Patty? But it's not funny, and it's not even that weird, especially this point in the show. It's weird for about 2 seconds, and then once again, the episode just becomes kinda boring, because the episode just gets really repetitive really fast. It's not even really that cringy at all. Also, the song is really lame and bland and not funny either. The only thing that really promotes a strong reaction from me is him killing all the scallops. Like, I know there's no continuity in this show, but come on, SpongeBob rips one in half. For kids watching who remember Junior, that could have totally been him. I don't know why they go so far with him brutally killing scallops. Also, I guess the patty at the very end for me honestly is the grossest thing all season. Like, it's so nasty the way they draw little worms on it. Ugh. But overall, while this episode is bad and tells one joke over and over again that isn't funny, I will say, unlike some other episodes, this one at least does kind of go all out with its terrible idea, which, even if it doesn't make the episode any better, does make the scenes a little more varied and interesting, to a point where I decided not to put this one on the list. This episode starts out pretty bad, with SpongeBob and Patrick annoyingly crying, but some of the stuff of them actually setting up this welcome home party for Sandy is kinda cute and a little funny, and that scene is what kept this one out of serious consideration for this list, which is great because this episode is awful. It's just a boring, repetitive story of these characters getting bitten by fleas and trying to get away from a growing flea infestation, which is so dull. There's barely even any jokes other than, isn't it funny these characters are getting bitten a lot? Maybe if this was a sea creature they had to escape throughout Bikini Bottom, and this episode had more locations and funny jokes around it, that would be one thing, but this episode takes place in one location with the same thing happening over and over again. Why would you make this episode if you didn't have interesting gags around this event, or just a more interesting idea in general? So yeah, it's pretty bad, but not top 5 bad. I don't think Pat No Pay is the worst thing ever, and maybe I should have left it out of this video entirely, but there just isn't really anything I like in it. And for being 4 minutes, it still just feels like a waste of time. Even if this concept was good, which it isn't, other shorts throw so many jokes at you, even the bad ones. And this one honestly has like 3 or 4 past the initial setup, and they're all kinda duds. I do think that initial setup is a little funny just cause, yeah, why would Krabs think Patrick could pay for these patties? But the actual jokes when he starts working for the Krusty Krab are just dull and feels like really predictable stuff we've seen before, as this premise just isn't great to begin with, as I said. Look, this episode is very short and goes by fast, and I don't despise it or anything, but it completely fails to even hold such a short runtime, and there really isn't much redeemable about it, so I did have to give it a mention. Oh, this one was dangerously close to making the list, and would be my honorary number 6. The plot is so bad, and the setup with everyone being so cruel to SpongeBob is so forced and out of character for everyone. And then the episode follows SpongeBob's weird amnesia story through Kelp City, which isn't interesting because the location is pretty dull, and then the rest of our characters are trying to find SpongeBob to bring him back, and I think what makes this episode fail, and specifically the story fail, really comes down to two reasons. Firstly, SpongeBob losing his memory for some reason is a really bad choice because it makes him not much of a character. So the story just amounts to him kind of dicking around Kelp City, and then he randomly becomes mayor, and then he leaves and gets his memory back. Not much happens, and it all feels really pointless. If SpongeBob was his normal self and wanted to find a life that truly made him happy, even after that horrible setup, let's say we left that in, but we followed a fully remembering conscious SpongeBob, that could have been at least kind of fun or interesting if that part was written better than the first chunk of the episode. But SpongeBob doesn't really even know who he is or what he wants, so everything that happens just falls flat and doesn't mean anything. And the other problem this episode has is that no character feels super engaged in this story anyways. If SpongeBob really wanted to get a job, or really wanted to stop the bubble popping gang, or really even wanted to become mayor to create change, that would be one thing, but he doesn't, making you not super interested in seeing him do any of that either. And they don't even make the story really crazy and interesting just doing a lot of stuff with any of those premises either, so there's that. And while most of the rest of the gang really want SpongeBob back, it doesn't really feel like there's actually that much urgency to get him back either. The special is just paced in such a slow, nonchalant way, which makes you not invested in that either. Especially with Squidward not caring at all, which makes sense for his character, but does contribute to this overall problem more, of making this plot not super interesting because a lot of the characters just don't feel that invested. So yeah, this is just another big time waster and bad special from the show with not a lot of jokes to begin with either. I will say though, with how much of an afterthought this special felt like and how annoying and kind of frustrating it is, I will say a lot of stuff does happen in it, even if stuff like the big chase scene with SpongeBob is just kind of bland, and the mystery of why the town hates bubbles is a little interesting. It's not interesting enough to keep me engaged or bring the episode up at all, and it really goes nowhere, so it doesn't matter anyways. Them trying to do more interesting things and there being a lot of random stuff that happens does make the episode feel slightly more varied and a little easier to sit through, which is why I put the really repetitive and mostly outwardly annoying boat smarts above this one. And I know I should mention the disturbing face in the episode, and honestly, it doesn't affect my opinion of the episode one way or the other. Like, it's disturbing, yes, but it's on the screen for such a short amount of time, and it's not anything I think would be too scary for any kid. And if the timing on any of the jokes in this episode was better, the joke in question would actually be pretty funny. Look at that, the last episode of the season, and it's one of the season's worst. Stanley is such a bad character, and he has no personality at all, and really all he is just a loser who is bad at everything. And that could be really funny, but it's not. It's not funny to watch him mess up at even the simplest tasks, because a lot of the time, there's really nothing else to the joke except, he messes up. And also a lot of the time, SpongeBob sticks up for him, but ends up getting crapped on for it, which is just really mean and not pleasant. That's really all this episode is, and you can't even really feel bad for Stanley, because once again, he's not much of a character. They really do nothing other than this in the episode, besides a few random one-off jokes, and it just makes the episode super repetitive, and it feels like it's not really amounting to anything because this episode doesn't have much of a story. It's literally just that joke over and over again. It's just so bland and boring. Man, I'm just so sick of this season. This whole thing is just a mess. But I will say, what brings the episode up a little bit is those few times they don't focus on this element and tell other jokes. They are actually pretty decent. The Patrick scene is pretty funny because they play into how lazy his character is, which kinda caught me off guard just how well it's written. And the DuckTales reference is also pretty funny. It got a chuckle out of me. So this episode was spared from being on the list proper. But with all that said, let's finish this list and get into what I think is the worst episode of this season. Surprise! Atlantis SquarePantis is number 1. Okay, so before I even say anything about this episode's quality, I gotta ask, for how hit or miss the specials in this show are, why did anyone think a 44-minute special was a good idea? The specials already have a hard time holding the runtime, and now they double the length on one to create a TV movie. But okay, let's take a step back for a second. Maybe this special could be okay. It is a musical and does have patchy segments. When SpongeBob does songs, it's usually one of the best parts of the show. And while the patchy segments are hit or miss, they're usually great, and when they are, they're the best parts of their respective specials. So the episode should hopefully be decent, at the very least a watchable, passable episode. So maybe this idea isn't the worst thing after all. That's before you realize the songs all season have been a huge downgrade, and the patchy segments in the only other special to feature patchy segments this season were pretty middle of the road. But still, this episode can't be that bad, right? Oh goodness, you wish. This is the worst episode of the show so far by a country mile. It's not even close. Everything about this episode fails. But it's not even that it fails. It's that there are a lot of things in this episode that are gift-wrapped to be at the very least serviceable. As I said, hopefully pretty good, and they are just trash. An epic SpongeBob adventure to this lost magical city filled with riches and scientific wonder could be so fun. But for some reason, they decide to do a Willy Wonka's Chocolate Factory type exploration of Atlantis, with everyone being exited from the story by song when they get to a certain room. Which is a weird choice, but could work if the episode was paced well. And Atlantis was visually interesting, and the episode was funny, and the songs were really good. But, shocker, the pacing is awful. This episode moves at a snail's pace, which I've said about other episodes on this list, but this one is 44 fucking minutes long, and it feels like twice that length. Which wouldn't be that big of an issue if a lot happened in this episode, but this episode just draws out most scenes that aren't very eventful to begin with. We get this long drawn out setup of our characters getting to Atlantis, and then when they arrive, they slowly walk around to different, not super interesting rooms. None of what they see is actually visually fun, interesting, or memorable at all. It's not worth the long drawn out setup, and to get to any of these places, a large chunk of the episode takes place in the boring hallways of Atlantis. And there's nowhere near as many jokes as there should be for this episode's crushing length, and all the ones there are either also just super unmemorable or overwritten schlock that isn't punchy to give this episode any sort of life. And the songs, don't even get me started about the songs. Well, the songs in the rest of the season aren't great. They did not prepare me for how especially bad the songs here are. They're not fun to listen to, they're not catchy, and they're either really slow ear slugs to pad the episode out and make it even more tedious to sit through, or they're insanely overwritten songs that don't even end up feeling like much of a song because they'll have parts getting dragged out or going on way too long, having painfully forced rhymes or overwritten jokes that are just so painful to sit through and unfunny. The songs don't sound good, and the singing not being great doesn't make it any better. And while some songs are worse than others on that front, and that on its own doesn't really bother me, it's more the fact that they didn't care to create these songs around characters' singing voices like you should do with a character, or even voice actor, actress more generally, who can't sing for whatever the reason may be. Just laziness on all fronts, and that's what bothers me about the songs more than anything, is that they just feel like lazy rush jobs that no one really cared about actually sounding good or working as songs or being any sort of quality. And this is a big part of the episode. It takes up quite a bit of time. And while some are better than others, all are far from good. Like, I think Sandy's song is the best, just because it's probably the shortest, other than maybe Plankton's, and is the most catchy. And I do like the retro game graphics that accompany it, but this episode doesn't do much with that, and the singing and the writing in the song is just as bad as the others. The worst, in my opinion, has gotta be Squidward's song, because it has all the problems I mentioned at their very worst. And the songs don't even do a great job expressing how a character is feeling about something or moving the plot along in a fun way, like in most musicals, because this episode is so shitty and badly written. Outside of all that, the two actual narratives to give this episode some sense of an actual story, being SpongeBob and Patrick seeing the world's oldest living bubble, and Plankton getting advanced weaponry in Atlantis, all just feels pointless, as it doesn't amount to anything, and wasn't that interesting to begin with. SpongeBob and Patrick just see this bubble and pop it in predictable fashion, and this doesn't change even with the dumb fake out they try to include. That's it. That's what this plot in this 44-minute crushing episode amounted to. So pointless. And on Plankton's end, he doesn't do anything the entire episode, and you question why they even included him, and then you think him getting this tank is gonna make this episode more fun and lively, but no, it doesn't end up working the way he thought, and that's the end of that. And you're still like, why do they even include him? There's a boring, repetitive chase scene before we get to that. What else is new? And then our characters get sent home with one final terrible song to finally end this horrible episode and put me out of my misery. This episode is just so ass, and that would put me out of my misery if we didn't have to finish the patchy segments, which I haven't even gotten to yet because the SpongeBob portion of this episode is so bad. But would you believe the patchy segments are even worse? Patchy's home disappears, and the link to the SpongeBob's part of the episode is Lost City, I guess, but the rest of Patchy's story follows these weird and cringy delusions and this really awkward song sequence. Though the song itself is better than anything in the SpongeBob segment, though that's not saying much, it's all just so awkward and cringy in the most unfunny way possible, and then it's revealed the city was shrunk by these weird fucking aliens, and they grow it back, and that's it. Just so brain-rottingly stupid. It's really hard to sit through just for how poorly written and honestly cringe it all is, even though I don't usually like using that word. I'm losing brain cells just talking about it. And that's the thing about this one. It just feels like nobody cared and took the laziest approach in creating a 44-minute TV movie, just like the effort put into the songs, or lack thereof. And this leads to even more missed opportunities for this episode to have a fun story or great jokes, and even something especially dumb like having David Bowie in a musical but not singing. Just such a hilariously incompetent 44-minute TV movie, and all this makes this episode the hardest and longest thing to sit through all season. Which is why, despite how shockingly bad the last couple episodes are, this one tops the list easily. Nothing compares to this episode. And for that reason, it's the worst episode of SpongeBob Season 5. And with that, thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe for more videos similar to this in the future. Also, leave a comment telling me what you thought of my list and what your own list would have been. And just what your overall thoughts on Season 5 are. I'd love to hear what you have to say. The best list should come out within the next few weeks or so stay tuned. And until next time, this has been Chocolate Guy, signing off.